have about data mining and predictive analytics. You can consider this our free consulting segment of the webinar, open access, pardon me, to gurus Patrick and, Tony and Scott. So each question that you submit will receive 2 or 3 perspectives. We do have great questions coming in now. There's room for a few more, although we have had a great increase just in the last few minutes here. So I think we'll have plenty to keep us going here until 12:30. And thanks again for setting aside 90 minutes. Hopefully you found that there's been a lot of value that we packed into an hour and a half. I know it's a lot of time to set aside in a workday for a webinar. But if you have any others, we'll see if we can fit them in for myself, Tony, or Scott to respond. So let's take a look at the first. This is a great question that came in from Michael. I really like this. And I have the advantage of seeing the question ahead of time. Typically, I respond first because I have that advantage while Scott and Tony consider their responses. I'll do that in this case for Michael's question. Are unsupervised data mining techniques of any use? Are there enough success stories proving that there is a clear need for it? And absolutely, matter of fact, it's fairly popular. There's a lot of problems that don't have a dependent variable to it, and so to approach a lot of problems with clustering and segmentation is very popular. So let me give you one example, and then I'll hand it over to Scott, and then Tony will follow up. The use case that we worked on directly was for credit card fraud. And it was actually a large academic institution that wanted to put a predictive modeling surveillance program in place, and just for the staff to know that there was a system in place would help to encourage compliance. But the other part of it was the challenge was that they really had no historical cases of fraud, and so how would you train the model? Well, in this case, what we did was we did have previous historical purchasing behavior data, and plenty of it. So what we did was an unsupervised learning approach. We clustered behaviors based upon both distance mapping in multidimensional space along with pattern matching. And these clusters were built in that way. And we worked with the users to define the number of clusters that we could work with. And we would then stand by for any known cases of fraud, and then the model was already built. What we could then do was see what is the segment or the cluster that behavior maps to, and of course, matching behaviors, similar behaviors to that, would be the ones that we would then target the auditing on and see if that cluster does prove out to be the one that is most significant. And then, of course, the more cases that come in, the more that we can define other clusters that were preformed with similar behaviors and distance mapping. So that's one example where we were able to back into it without historical data, but still define a model that was very effective at defining those similar behaviors and then being able to define them based upon future cases of fraud. So that's one example that I have. Let me go over to Scott for other productive cases where you don't have that dependent variable, and clustering and segmentation can be very helpful.
Okay, Michael, that's a very good question, and I'll underscore what Eric said about the importance of it and the use of it. A big case can be made that beyond clustering, that association analysis is an unstructured technique. Because you don't have indicators ahead of time and you're trying to find out how to group things. And of course, when you're talking about association analysis or frequent item set analysis, you're talking about the types of techniques that Netflix uses to suggest other titles. You're talking about next product purchases on Amazon or similar types of purchases. So not only is it important, but it's used quite a bit in the world of both big data and the more traditional predictive analytics and data mining. With respect to predictive analytics and data mining, to expand on what Eric was talking about, quite often we are working in an algorithmic situation where you can have too many variables. And when you have too many variables, as we talked about in the presentation, you can get into overfitting. You can it can create a lot of problems. So sometimes what we do is we use unstructured techniques to develop what we call factors or principal components analysis, where we're collapsing the information contained in many variables into one variable and reduce some of the problems that we get into when we develop models.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Scott. And we did resolve that feedback problem. Do apologize earlier where I've even muted muted Tony during the presentation, trying to eliminate the background noise. So thanks for your patience with that. Tony, would you like to extend on the unsupervised learning?
Yeah, and just in a little bit more general sense, I think that my use of unsupervised learning is largely done in the data preparation stage. One of the things that I'm very adamant about is ensuring that in all of these options, for example, how many different groups would we have in cluster analysis, that we analyze those in the context of their impact on our business performance metrics. But what's really, to me, very useful with cluster analysis and profiling and factor analysis and so forth is the ability to go in and take this raw data and put it into mathematically correct groups and then determine the number of groups that have an impact. And in your example, that's really what you did, is you went out on an exploratory basis and found the groupings themselves and then looked at how those groups behave differently based on the value that was received from the auditing of different groups. And I think that's the kind of usage where unsupervised learning generally can be very powerful in helping us create these groups in very complex environments of data.
That's a great approach and a great compliment to my response and Scott's response. Thanks very much for that. Tony, not Tony Rathburn, but another Tony asks, when you know you have plenty of raw data, but you don't know what your questions are, how do you start? In my case, I work on large physics experiments that analyzes petabytes of data on grid resources and want to know how to improve the way that we do that. I have data on what we did, but don't know the right questions to ask to improve performance. Put differently, the metric I want to improve is the rate of discovery of physics, but I have no idea how to measure that from PCU times, network use, disk capacities, etc. How do I start? And Tony, you may have seen in that 6-phase process model, the first phase there is plan. And that's where you can take a look at a lot of aspects that determine whether you're even at the starting line for building a predictive model. And one thing you don't want to do is be a technology looking for a home. Those often don't get off the ground. But rather understand what are the motivations of leadership, of the organization, of the operations of users, and prioritize those. Then take a look at the resources you have and the approaches you have. You come up with a cross-section of what are viable projects, viable approaches. Do the resources support those stated objectives? If yes, then you've got a great strategy that's got a much higher propensity to succeed and have impact. If not, then you've averted a failed attempt of, like we were saying in this webinar, building a great model, but it ultimately is not adopted or applied or has benefit or doesn't really match up with what others care about to be able to take it forward. So I would say the plan phase is very critical in this perspective. Now, where you have a lot of data and trying to determine, based on the nature of the data, how does it apply? Let me take that out and feel free to start with Tony this time to address any aspect of that question where plenty of raw data, not sure how to start, petabytes, don't know the right questions to ask to improve performance. The metric he has is discovery, rate of discovery of physics. Is there some advice you can give to Tony?
That was an interesting transition, Tony. I think two thoughts come to mind immediately here. One, I think it's very important to know when we can use these kinds of tools and techniques effectively. I also think it's very important to know when not to. And as Eric was alluding to, there are 5 key criteria that I have for when predictive analytics is appropriate. I need to have a business objective. I need to have performance metrics that that represent how well we're doing. Relative to those objectives, I need to understand the behavior that impacts performance. I need to have available data that's sufficient to develop a model of that behavior. And then I need to have a scarce resource that I'm allocating. If I don't have all 5 of those components, I'm not ready to do predictive analytics, and that's okay. There may be a different approach. The other issue that comes to mind on this, Tony, is you're doing physics. And very clearly there's a difference between physical systems modeling and human behavior modeling. Now, if what you're looking at is how you allocate your available resources on researcher time, on money and budgets and so forth, then I think maybe we can go with more traditional uses as we've been discussing with predictive analytics. But if you're truly talking about doing physics, I think this presentation is probably a little bit different than what you're really looking for, because our behaviors that we're identifying in our formulas that we're developing aren't really intended to describe how the system works. We're looking at allocating resources by defining groups and adjusting resource allocations, where in physics you're building mathematical models where the variables in the model actually describe how the system works. And that's a different mentality.
Great advice. I think that'll be very helpful to Tony. Scott, any additional advice for Tony, or would you like me to go on to the next?
Well, I heard the question just slightly different, and I may have it wrong, but I do have some thoughts for Tony. You know, to cut to the bottom line, if you don't have problems to address or specific questions that can be quantified, then you can't apply these techniques. I'm not sure what it means, what you mean by the rate of discovery in physics, but you know, what we do is totally objective driven. There's a problem that you need to solve that has been defined, and we apply these techniques to try to gather insights and address the problems, use the data to address the problems. So if that doesn't exist, you know, probably one of the worst situations you can find yourself in is to have a solution to something where there's no question, or a problem in search of an answer in search of a problem. My advice to you is to go out and meet with the particular users or the particular interested parties of the data, and to sit down with them and say, okay, let's talk about this. Let's see if we can come up with some specific questions that might be addressable through data mining and predictive analytics. Now, the way I heard the question just slightly different was I heard the word process, I believe, or processing, and that's really a kind of a different type of question. If I heard it correctly, the feeling I got from it was that you were talking about processing efficiencies. Data mining and predictive analytics is actually a process that involves processing, but processing can be a separate kind of question that's more of an IT-related type of, has more of an IT type of an answer.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. It's always great to have another perspective or spin on the answer, and that's why we have the 3 of us here for that. I think Tony has a PS, an addendum for that, for this same question.
Yeah, and that's the disadvantage of going first. While I was listening to Scott, I was processing.
Yeah.
Tony, the thing that does come to mind here, and given the first question that we answered, I'm going to go back to it. I think this is a case where truly unsupervised learning might be appropriate. You're dealing with a physical system. You're not dealing with resource allocation. You're dealing with physics, and what you're looking for are relationships in the data that you may not be aware of. And going back into techniques like clustering, like factor analysis, like self-organizing maps, where you're truly doing just the discovery process and not really concerned with enhancing a particular business objective, you may be able to use those kinds of unsupervised techniques to find relationships in the data that weren't previously known. And it's not that they're guaranteed to have value, but they may give you some direction on what types of things may be occurring in the data that may be a foundation for future research.
Great, and thanks for that extra consideration. I think hopefully that's a lot of great considerations and help to you, Tony. I'm going to go on to a question from Savio, who reposed a question, and thanks for your patience, Savio. I know you posed this question as part of your webinar registration. So let me go ahead and read this. Gosh, who did we start with last? Oh, we started with Tony, then went to Scott, back to Tony. So this time we'll start with Scott. Can predictive models analyze consumer buying behavior in real time? Let's start with you, Scott.
Oh, you better believe it. As a matter of fact, that's an emerging area of predictive analytics, real-time types of modeling. As a matter of fact, if you after the webinar, if you want to go out and you want to Google some stuff, look for dynamic models. There are actually new techniques that are evolving that not only work in real time in terms of modeling, but the models themselves adjust to current conditions. So you better believe it. It's huge, especially in stuff like the stock market and process control. But so absolutely, absolutely.
Tony.
Very briefly, it's very easy to implement these models so that they can become real-time systems, and they've been doing that kind of work, as Scott was mentioning, in the stock market for 20 years. That's very easy. Where I struggle with the idea of real-time model development is because I'm paranoid about whether or not these models are actually going to work when we go live, and I put a very heavy emphasis on the validation process. And when I see these kinds of dynamic modeling approaches being taken, they, by definition, end up sacrificing the validation process. That's, for me, I'm not saying it doesn't work, it's a major concern for me.
Sure, yeah. And one of the considerations I have from many who are new to the practice is they do hear, and they're correct, that predictive modeling is computationally intensive. Can it keep up with the demand? And I think they should understand that there's two different phases to this. One is the actual training of the model, and yes, that does take time, and it is that there is heavy mathematics to it, and it is iterative. Once that model is trained, the deployment of it for actual operation is actually very efficient. It's typically a number of multipliers, which are very efficient for real-time use. So as far as its ability to keep up with real-time analysis, once it's deployed, and like Tony says, make sure that it's well validated. You don't want to, Tony, you can. This is your own quote, right? I'm going to blot, I'm going to mess it up here, but I think it was. The only thing worse than a failed project is taking a failed project live. And if you don't know that that model is not going to hold up when you take it into real time, that's probably your biggest disaster. So again, we're trying to have organizations think more strategically about their analytics implementations. Most times they're not messing up because they're not building good enough models. They're not looking at a lot of the common sense. They're not applying the soft skills that are really required to arrive at fully productive, fully adopted models that produce residual benefit. And that's what we're trying to have organizations to consider so that they don't improperly dismiss predictive analytics and have to return to it later because they find that their competitors are eating their lunch. So a few questions remain. We're at 35. We're over our 90-minute time frame. We still have a little less than 2/3 still with us. But I think we're going to have to wrap it up shortly. And let me see if any of these are very quick to address. Tony, same Tony from earlier, quick question. What is uplift, incremental lift? That's actually a strategic treatment to analytics. And it's pretty brilliant. It's to say, how do we want to take action on the model, most often to marketing campaigns. So one example is, the treatment that you want to take for those, the highest value customers, and what to do with those that are maybe costing you or the lowest value. What do you do for some of the ones? The answer in many cases is nothing. You want to let sleeping dogs lie. Another promotion, or if you suffer from list exhaustion because you're over touching them, you come up with a strategy that's most appropriate for how you segment the results, and that's uplift modeling. What is the overall incremental gain that you can have for a better way to apply the model? It doesn't necessarily have to do with the model design itself or the tactics. And let me pause there because I hope I'm at least 90% right on that. Scott, do you have a different perspective on uplift, incremental lift, or was that kind of close enough in the essence of time?
Well, basically it comes from marketing. Started out in telecom, but it has sales promotion implications. Just because you have a response does not mean that that's going to generate incremental profits for you. If I were to hand out coupons at the grocery checkout line for $5 off to everybody, I could say I got 100% response. However, each one of those coupons cost me $5. Really what I'm trying to do with uplift modeling is I'm trying to target those individuals who would generate a new sale, who the incentive would generate an incremental purchase rather than subsidize an existing purchase.
Oh, great, great. Yeah, thanks for refining that. Tony Rathburn, anything left for Uplift Incremental?
No, the only thing that I want to add there is always go back to the real world performance metrics. Don't rely on the analytic metrics, and this is where people get caught up in a lot of this, and I think it's, Scott was saying, is the orientation that we're really keeping in mind there. When we take it back to business value, what's the incremental lift in business value over our current baseline, not over some theoretical baseline?
Yeah, but theoretical is much easier to work with, and the real world is harsh. Do I really have to work there?
It depends. Nobody's ever got a raise, bonus, or promotion based on our square lift.
Good point. Here's a quick question I'll address alone. Sunita asks, is Revolution Analytics providing the training in Las Vegas or Florida? They are not. I know where that confusion comes from. Again, our training, we do talk about various commercial and open source tools. We certainly want to be realistic about what's out there and give a direct feel of analytics. Revolution Analytics actually it references our training. I think they have a training schedule, and I'm getting some feedback here. Let me see if I can mute. They list our courseware. They believe in it, and they have it on their training schedule. So they simply point to our training. But no, there's no tool relationship, or and again, all things are balanced. We don't even go into really benefits or disparage any tools. We just look at them in terms of implementation. And Scott, here's a question. We have Scott's and Tony's asking questions to Scott and Tony. But Scott asks, is there a summary of this presentation that you're willing to share? What we do record and post the Q&A, so you can go back to that. That's online. You can find it, I believe, through our blog, and then it'll take you to our YouTube channel, or go to our website and click on the YouTube icon, and you'll see recordings of not just this Q&A session, but previous ones, where you can pick up a lot of great insights from the questions that come into us. We don't record the full webinar. We do that because we like to encourage live participation, but you can always come back next month. We have these monthly, and we have the next 3 productions listed that you can sign up for on the webinar page, and you'll find that on the nav bar of our website. But now, at almost 20 till the hour, I think we better draw this one to a close. I'd certainly like to thank our attendees today for your sustained interest and your active participation. You were phenomenal on the polling, as well as Scott and Tony for your great segments, and of course your valuable Q&A contributions. We'll follow up with an email shortly with some resources and suggestions that will hopefully be useful to you, and from there we'll hope you've already offered permission for us to stay in touch through the Modeling Agency's newsletter, and that you'll consider joining us at a public training event soon. Now remember to act quickly to secure one of the 4 remaining very early bird 25% discounts for the December production. Let me go back and try muting again. Sorry, it's what happens in live events, right? If that timing or location doesn't work for you, keep in mind that the Orlando event is at a beautiful DoubleTree that's accessible to all the popular Orlando attractions if you'd like to bring your family with you. And don't forget that your colleagues can join you for any time, up to 30% off. Now, if you don't have a training or travel budget and would like the guidance of a seasoned mentor like Scott or Tony, you might be interested in the Modeling Agency Escort On-Call program. Escort On-Call is essentially a retainer account that provides remote open access to a TMA senior consultant. Simply open up an Escort On-Call account, and you've instantly added a wealth of experience and capability to your existing bench without expanding payroll, administrating complicated contracts, or taking elevated risk on larger commitments. We'll get you the answers you want, guide you through it, show you how it's done, implement any data mining tasks you may wish to delegate, and then remain on call until the next time you need us. And meanwhile, when we're not actively working, you're not paying a dime. So a link to the Escort on-call description page will be among the resources included in the follow-up email. On behalf of myself, Scott, and Tony, thank you again for attending Data Mining Failure to Launch. Please excuse us again for the feedback and the background noise. Have a very pleasant afternoon and evening, and this brings the webinar broadcast to a close.